Okay.
Right. Welcome to Beyond Citation Counting, Metrics and Altmetrics for Demonstrating Scholarly Impact, part of a series of online discussions brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. I am Taylor Ralph, a member of the committee, and I will be moderating this program along with my colleague, Sam Harlow. This is one of an ongoing series of online programs sponsored by our committee, and at the end of the session, I will give you more information about upcoming programs. This session is being recorded, and when the recording is ready, we will send the link to the video to everyone who registered for the program. The program today will consist of approximately 45 minutes of presentation from our panelists, followed by a question and answer session. Please post your questions in the chat box, and we will collect all of them and answer as many as we can at the end. We will post a link to a program assessment in the chat box after the Q&A session, so please take a few moments to give us your feedback on today's program. With those announcements out of the way, I am very happy to start today's program. We are joined today by Erin Owens. Erin Owens is the Access Services Coordinator and Scholarly Communications Librarian at Sam Houston State University, where she has been a member of the library faculty in varying roles for nearly 12 years. Although her informal work in scholarly communications began much earlier, Erin now formally supported this area for 3 years, providing learning opportunities and consultations for faculty and graduate students on topics related to scholarly publishing, copyright and open licensing, research impact metrics, and much more. Erin currently serves on the ACRL Research and Scholarly Environment Committee, the College and Research Libraries Editorial Board, and as a peer reviewer for several LIS journals, all while also pursuing her own research agenda. So without further delay, I will hand it over to Erin.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So you've just heard a little bit of a brief introduction to who I am. Here's my photograph in case it helps you to see the person who's actually talking to you today. And so what I'd like to do to get started is to get to know a little bit more about you, about who I'm speaking to. So I've got just a couple of poll questions we're going to go through to give me a sense of your background in this area. So Ilois, would you mind putting up the first poll? All right, so here's our first poll question, just a very simple yes or no. Does your title or job description include scholarly communications, research metrics, or a related responsibility? And we'll take just a couple of seconds there to let you answer. All right, so we've got the results coming in. About 68% of you said no, 32% said yes. Okay, great. That's really helpful. I was making an assumption I would be speaking largely to people that are not already working in this area, but that's helpful to confirm. So then our second poll question will be coming up. So Lois, are you loading the second poll question, please?
I'm grabbing it. Hold on.
Okay, thanks. All right, there we are, poll 2. how often have you collected metrics for a scholarly published work in the past, whether that was just for yourself or at a request from a faculty member or administrator? And that might be never, only once or twice, occasionally, or regularly. And again, we'll just take a few seconds to give you a chance to respond. All right, so we've got our results in. It looks like most people said occasionally, the 36%, and then a bunch of people also said never or just once or twice. Only a very small percent have done it regularly. Okay, again, that's really helpful to just confirm my sense of your experience level going into this conversation. All right, and then Alois, if you would mind putting up our third and final poll question.
Hold tight. A little technical issue here.
Okay. Well, and if the third one decides not to cooperate, I can just move on. All right, there we go. So this is our third and last poll. How would you rank your existing knowledge of research metrics on a scale from 1 very low to 5 very high? Just take a few more seconds, let the responses come in. All right, so it looks like most of you said about a 2, between a 2 and a 3. Okay, terrific. Well, thank you guys very much for responding to those polls, giving me a sense of who's out there in the audience listening. And hopefully by the end of the session, you will feel like your knowledge has increased a little bit. So I've got just a couple of my learning objectives up here. I won't necessarily read all of these to you, but we're going to go through some definitions and then talking about metrics and tools. Just a quick outline of the presentation here. We'll go through the presentation material in a question period, and then my slides will be made available online. So there's a few slides at the end that you'll be able to reference the various tools that I'm going to mention and some of the publications that I cite. So I just wanted you all to know in advance you'll be able to get to that information. So starting out with some definitions, I think in any discussion, it helps to make sure we're speaking the same language. So I want to start out by suggesting a few definitions for some of the concepts we're working with. First of all, research metrics. Research metrics are quantitative measurements that are intended to evaluate a research product. Many of them focus specifically on the attention that is received by a research product, and many of them focus on journal articles as the type of product. But there are others out there, there are exceptions to that. The next term, bibliometrics. These are research metrics based on measuring citations. So anytime we talk about something that's citation-based, you can think of that as being bibliometrics. This could be citations to a whole journal, to one specific work, or to a researcher, etc. And these citations may be evaluated with different formulas. So next, the term alternative metrics, or Altmetrics for short. This describes a broad array of different metrics that evaluate attention through things other than citations. And it's particularly centered on digital engagement. such as views, downloads, or social media mentions. Altmetrics can apply to journal articles and books, as well as more diverse products like presentation slides, data sets, and more. So the last term I want to define is impact. We often hear people talk about gathering metrics to show the impact of a work, but the definition of that term varies, sometimes a little and sometimes a lot, based on the context that we're in. A public health researcher, for example, is going to have a very different idea of what impactful scholarship looks like compared to a literature researcher. And that's appropriate because the work they're doing is so different. So to provide a foundation for our discussion, I'm going to borrow a definition for impact from the book Meaningful Metrics by Romer and Borchardt, 2015. They define impact as including two principles: the principle of effect, in the sense of a perceptible shift, change, or influence, and the principle of force, in the sense of the strength or degree of the effect. So this gives us this two-part idea of where a work can be said to have an effect and to what extent the force of that effect can be quantified and benchmarked. So why do we care about metrics? I think it's helpful to start off with at least a little bit of the why factor. And the first thing to understand is that there's going to be very different motivations for different stakeholders. The individual researcher versus their university administration are going to have different reasons for caring about finding research metrics. I wanted to pose just a few examples of some of these reasons for different stakeholders. Strategic spending. Libraries can use journal-level metrics to select where they spend their limited budget on subscriptions. Competitive decisions. Article and researcher metrics might give a researcher an edge, things like hiring, awarding grants. Relative ratings. Various metrics may be used to quantify the relative performance of individuals. Think for purposes like tenure and promotion or merit pay. Now, I will definitely note that the way this is done is not always fair and is often not done in accordance with best practices, but I wanted to acknowledge the reality that it still happens. And then external validation. So researcher and institutional metrics may be used to help validate a researcher, a department, or an institution's importance. And this may help to attract students into a program, to attract faculty to work for a university, to attract donors to give money, that type of thing. So these are just some examples of some of the reasons why people may care about gathering research metrics. So before I dive into some individual metrics, I wanted to share this graphic from El Profesional de la Información. I love this periodic table of scientometric indicators. I think this really just helps to illustrate the scope of the landscape that we're talking about. So obviously I can't discuss all of these. Just be aware there's much more to be learned if you decide to go down that rabbit hole. Unfortunately, this graphic itself does not actually link out to details about each of these metrics, but other resources like the Metrics Toolkit or the Snowball Metrics website can be helpful for getting definitions and details about specific metrics. And again, these resources will all be linked in the slides so you can refer to them. So journal bibliometrics, citation-based metrics for journals, and particularly the impact factor, are some of the metrics I think that are most familiar to people coming into this. These are based on the number of citations that a journal receives to its published content. Impact factor and cite score are very similar, but they're based on different databases of content. So the Web of Science database versus Scopus. These metrics are not available for every journal, but only for those which are indexed in the Web of Science or the Scopus database. And the calculation itself is only counting citations from other works that are indexed in that same database. So it's helpful to understand that these are not really comprehensive universal metrics. The Cabell's Classification Index from Cabell's Scholarly Analytics is another metric for journals. It can show a journal's influence in its broad field and in specific subtopics. Cabell's may cover different journals than what are in Web of Science and Scopus, and their breakdown of topics within a discipline can be different. So this provides another alternative in situations where a journal metric is appropriate. But it isn't always appropriate. These metrics describe only the journal level, and they should not be used as a proxy for evaluating either an individual researcher or an individual article or research product. Because of that sort of limitation, and because I think this is a little more familiar of an area anyway, I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on this. But when we talk about citation-based metrics, we should also talk briefly about citation-based metrics for individual articles. Web of Science and Scopus are both useful for identifying citations that are coming from other scholarly works. You can also check out the free app from dimensions.ai, which is a somewhat newer product on the scene. They list citing works not only from scholarly publications, but also looking at grants, patents, clinical trials, and policy documents. You may want to search dissertations and theses databases to discover citations by graduate students. Google Scholar and the Publish or Perish software from Dr. Anwil Hartzing are also both excellent tools for finding more citations outside of Web of Science and Scopus. And honestly, even just the basic Google web search can help to find non-scholarly citations. And then sometimes you may want to dig into specialized search engines like GrayNet that search gray literature, government documents, public policy documents, that kind of thing, depending on what type of audience you think might be reading and citing a particular work. Whenever we're evaluating citations to a specific work, we want to think about not just tallying up the total number of citations that each database provides, but actually creating an index of every citing work. And I say that because a lot of times what we find in Web of Science and Scopus and Google Scholar is going to represent a lot of overlap, and sometimes, particularly in Google Scholar's case, sometimes erroneous citations where it's maybe not actually citing that work, or where there may be other problems. So if we actually create a spreadsheet of those, we can deduplicate them, verify them, and clean up that data so that we have a more accurate picture of how many times this has been cited, but also about the context in which it's been cited. So if an article has been cited 20 times, that doesn't tell us anything about how or why it was cited or by whom. Was it a derivative study that reused and validated the work's methodology, which might be very significant? Or was it just sort of part of a passing footnote acknowledging it as part of the literature, which might be less significant? So we can always boost our argument for a scholar's impact by providing that contextual narrative where we go beyond just a count and talk about why the work mattered. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little about Altmetrics, which encompasses many different measures of online attention. So in starting, I want to quickly distinguish between two terms. We have Altmetrics with a small a and an s, which generally refers to alternative metrics as a group. But this is not to be confused with Altmetric, big A, no s, which is a specific commercial company that provides Altmetrics gathering tools. For clarity in this presentation, I'm often going to try to refer to that company as altmetric.com, just so that you can have a better distinction in my voice of whether I'm using big A or little a Altmetric. So earlier in the presentation, we defined Altmetrics as evaluating attention by means other than citations, particularly with digital engagement. These alternative metrics can really expand an opportunity to show that a researcher's work has impact. This is in no small part because it honestly just takes time to get cited. And the average length of time to citation varies a lot between disciplines. So it could take years before a researcher can really show that their work is important by way of formal citations. But they can much more quickly point to other types of attention, like views and downloads, actions which demonstrate interest and which might eventually lead to formal citations from some of those people that are paying attention. It's also worth noting that a number of the Altmetrics tools I'm going to discuss provide options to reuse their badges, their little visual indicators, which we'll talk about in a moment, that highlight the attention a work has already received. So being able to take those badges and position them in other key locations can assist a researcher in driving new attention to their work. Now, a digital object identifier, or DOI, is the thing that's most commonly used to track altmetrics. Many articles are assigned a DOI at publication, but that depends on the journal. Some journals may not take that step. If you want to track altmetrics for a work that doesn't already have a DOI, you may want to consider uploading it to a repository that offers them, something like Figshare or OSF, Open Science Foundation. First, of course, be sure you understand whether there are any copyright or licensing issues with that upload, for instance, if it is a work that's already been published. But if you're able to obtain a DOI like this, it can really help you to gain those altmetrics for videos, slides, code, data sets, anything, not just an article. And that flexibility of application to lots of different types of work is part of what really makes altmetrics valuable. So now that our work has a DOI to identify it, let's shift into looking at some of the major tools that can help us aggregate these attention metrics. PlumX is one of the major subscription tools out there. They measure scholarly citations, usage, captures, mentions, and engagement from across many different platforms. And they take all that information and they distill it into a little badge or visualization, which they call the plum print, like a thumbprint. And that's that little blobby purple guy that you see over on the slide. Although they do primarily offer an institutional subscription product, they also provide a free tool, what's called a DOI lookup tool. Basically, it's a little root URL. You add a DOI to the end of the URL and then paste it into a browser. And this screenshot that you're seeing actually illustrates the data that is available for free with that DOI lookup tool. So that I've been able to look up the DOI number here of this article and see all of this information about its citations, usage, and captures. And again, that DOI lookup tool will be in the resources at the end of the slides. Now this is altmetric.com, which I already mentioned because of their name. They survey public policy documents, blogs, mainstream media, scholarly citations, Wikipedia, social media, and a ton of other things. And they distill all of that down into what they call the donut. So that's their round, colorful badge here. Again, institutional subscription, but also providing free resources. One of these is the Altmetric Explorer for librarians. It actually provides free access to their interface. Not as many features as you get in the institutional version, but it does allow you to look up individual works. And that's, again, what this screenshot is showing. I wanted you to get a sense of exactly how much data you can get for free. Seeing here all the different components that make up this donut, and then having access to these tabs where you can go in and access details about each of these components. The second resource they offer for free is a browser plugin. They call it a bookmarklet that anybody could install in their browser and use from any web page that has a DOI to instantly look up the attention donut for that DOI. So that's a really nice, quick click way to do it from your browser. And then there's dimensions.ai from Digital Science. I briefly mentioned them a moment ago for tracking scholarly citations, but they also provide the Altmetric donut in their information. So that's actually another free way to access Altmetrics tracking, along with the other diverse data that Dimensions can provide. So now both altmetric.com and Plum have deals with a lot of commercial publishers and vendors. So if your library subscribes to databases like EBSCO Discovery Service, which is the one that's captured here on the slide, or Science Direct, Taylor and Francis Online, Wiley Online Library, and some others, you may actually be able to access the Altmetric donut or the Plum print for at least some of the content in those databases and publisher websites. So even if your library or institution doesn't have access to a big subscription product, you may actually find access to things through some of your existing library subscriptions. One more tool that I want to mention here is Impact Story. Impact Story does not incorporate nearly as many metrics as Altmetric and Plum, but it's free and it doubles as a researcher profile, including it provides one place where you can link out to open access versions of your work as a researcher. Now, one reason I especially like it is it provides some more unique measures that are aligned with different values. So for instance, they give these little badges that talk about what percentage of your work is available open access, or how global is your reach. How does your work impact researchers in the global south? Things like that. And I think these alternative values-based metrics can be really important for discussing the type of attention that a work receives. Now, I do want to consider a few other types of metrics that can be used to describe individual outputs or works. We've looked at scholarly impact and online attention, but what about impact on teaching? If a researcher's work is adopted as course material, that could present a whole new angle to talk about why that work is important. One tool that can help is the Open Syllabus Project. It'll search through the contributed syllabi for either the title of a work or an author. Just be aware that it's not a comprehensive database of course syllabi, so sometimes it can be a little trickier to dig into discovering whether a class is using a work. Now, many of the metrics we've discussed so far have focused on journal articles, but in some disciplines, books are actually the gold standard for research output. So altmetric.com has been expanding their product to provide Altmetric for books, which gives an attention overview pretty much just like journal articles, but it uses an ISBN rather than a DOI. And this is a screenshot of an example for this book, Shadow Libraries. And you can see the donut is built from the same types of attention outlets that they look at for journal articles. You might also look at holdings for a book in WorldCat libraries. So how many libraries hold it? How internationally is it held? That kind of thing. Reviews are another data point for books. This could include scholarly reviews in disciplinary journals, or short reviews targeted at librarians, think Choice Library Journal, that kind of thing. And even non-scholarly reader reviews from sites like Goodreads or Amazon. My recommendation is aiming to pull quality anecdotes out of those reviews. So instead of just a simple count of how often it's been reviewed, note a review by some important figure, or pull a substantive quote out of a review, that type of thing. And of course, if a book, article, or any other type of work wins an award, we want to track things like awards as a metric of impact. And then I want to touch briefly on a few sort of evolving or emerging metrics that might be less familiar. One of these is the field-weighted citation ratio, or field citation ratio. This is sometimes available in Dimensions.ai or other sources. And basically it tries to take into account not just how many citations the one work received, but how many are usually received by articles in that same field. So trying to put it into context for its own discipline. One very specific type of field citation ratio is the RCR, or Relative Citation Ratio, developed by the National Institutes of Health. At the moment, this is really only used with biomedical literature, things that are in the PubMed database starting about 1995, but it is being explored to possibly be expanded to other fields like the arts and humanities. And I want to shift to talking about the arts and humanities for a moment, because a lot of the quantitative metrics that we discuss are really geared more towards the sciences and the way they do scholarship. The humanities are often very disadvantaged in gathering those quantitative metrics. So there's a project underway called Humetrics HSS. The HSS stands for Humanities and Social Sciences. This is an initiative for kind of rethinking how we measure excellence in academia. And they're proposing a values-based framework that would look at a scholar's progress in the areas of collegiality, quality, equity, openness, and community. They're still kind of wrestling with how all of that's going to be measured, but this is a really intriguing area to watch as it evolves, to put a little bit of a different spin on the way that we think of value and impact. And then lastly, here I want to mention Research Quality Plus, or RQ Plus. This is a measure that's been defined by, from Canada actually, by the International Development Research Center in Ottawa. And it is trying to take contextual factors into consideration. So they see RQ Plus being grounded in the local experience. And specifically, they've argued that it would provide a better mechanism for evaluating research from the global south by really grounding it in the local experience and not trying to compare it to other experiences and contexts when measuring its value. So these are some of the emerging areas here that I think are useful to watch. So we talked about metrics for individual outputs. I also wanted to touch briefly on metrics for researchers themselves. The H-index is the most familiar metric for individual researchers, though it can also be applied to departments, universities, journals, other kinds of bodies of research. The H-index tries to balance both productivity and impact. So in other words, it's trying to balance how much you publish and how much your publications are cited. So the point at which an author has at least H papers with H citations each gives the H-index. It's a little weird to say it out loud that way. So if you've published 10 papers and one of them has 50 citations, but the rest of them only have about 2 citations each, then your H-index might still be only 2, because you're not exceeding a point where you have at least 2 papers with 2 citations each. So it helps from that. It helps prevent that one paper with 50 citations from skewing things too far. H-index has some weaknesses. It largely favors senior over junior researchers, and it's still really only helpful for comparing researchers within the same field. Now, I will add there are a lot of less commonly referenced spin-offs of H-index. There's the H5 index and the G-index. And just this spring, in the February and March issues of the journal Scientometrics, there's been this whole debate over a proposed H-alpha index. So there's a lot of other measures there that are somewhat similarly related. But H-index is by far the one that is the most commonly seen and the easiest to find, because it's generally available through Web of Science, Google Scholar, Publish or Perish, tools like that. Now, having talked about all these metrics, I would be remiss if I didn't stop and talk for a moment about their limitations. We really need to understand the strengths and shortcomings both. So first of all, when we're looking at metrics based on citation, we want to maintain perspective, because it is not always clear why authors cite and what it means that they include or exclude a particular citation. What is that meant to communicate? Even just beyond citation-based metrics, though, thinking about all research metrics more broadly, they're all inherently backward-looking. If you have ever heard a radio advertisement, I love these, the radio ads for investment opportunities, mutual funds, things like that. They always have that fine print at the end of the ad where the man's voice says, past performance is not an indicator of future results. And I think that perfectly applies here to metrics, that it tells us what someone has done, doesn't necessarily guarantee what they're going to do. Some other limitations of metrics: possible manipulation, gaming the system. This usually just requires motivation. With traditional citation metrics, those could be manipulated through self-citation, through authors making reciprocal citation deals. I'll cite you if you cite me. Journal editors pressuring authors to cite other things from their journal, that type of thing. And when we get into alt metrics like views and downloads, those could be manipulated through bots, through paying other people to boost the appearance of attention, a professor requiring students to download his work, or all kinds of things. Any number can be used out of context or can be misconstrued or misinterpreted. That's always a risk. And sometimes there are simply gaps in what numbers we can actually find. But the absence of readily available metrics does not just automatically equal the absence of impact. And then there's this question of economics of access. When researchers and their institutions place a premium on metrics and researchers feel pressured to only publish in high impact journals, for instance, well, those tend to be very expensive. So who is being excluded from the scholarly discussion circle that's being created there? Researchers at small institutions with small library budgets, researchers in developing countries, and other people like that would not have access to the work in these expensive high-impact journals. So they're excluded from the conversation that's created. And I do think it's worth noting that as one limitation of putting too much stock in quantitative metrics alone. And then fundamentally, there's an argument that when we overemphasize these somewhat arbitrary quantitative measurements in order to justify research as worthwhile, this kind of undermines the philosophy that the pursuit of knowledge has its own intrinsic value. So in other words, if a work is not cited in 2 years, or it's not cited in 20 years, does that indicate that it has no value? That it does not have capacity for future value? Or that the researcher is not still worthy of recognition for their pursuits and accomplishments? So there is a little bit of I think, a philosophical struggle there for some people. So taking into account these limitations, I wanted to share a few considerations for using metrics responsibly. First and foremost, keep in mind that different types of impact require different metrics. Be sure you're picking the metrics that are appropriate for the type of impact you want to show. Use a metric only as intended. Make sure you understand its definition. What is it meant to describe? And making sure you're applying it accordingly. Use a constellation of metrics. Never try to reduce a researcher, an article, or a body of work down to one single number. Present metrics in context, not in isolation. And keep in mind that ultimately, metrics can measure different types of impact and attention, but they do not actually measure quality. Expert peer review is what does that. And I've included some links here to some related resources. For instance, the 2012 San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, recommends abandoning the use of journal-level metrics in decisions like hiring, promotion, and funding. And this sort of goes back to what I said earlier about journal-level metrics only describe the journal, and they shouldn't be used as a proxy for an individual. But in many cases at institutions, they are. And so DORA has given researchers and institutions a way to sign on their support to say that that's an inappropriate use of those metrics. So I think the best approach is often to think first about the story. I chose this image for the slide because I saw this photo and it made me think, oh, there is a story there about what happened to that guy. And a scholarly work or a researcher's body of work should be the same way. There's a story there, even if it's not immediately self-evident. So write that story first and use it as the framework for the metrics. A good story should describe the individual's identity as a researcher. What do they study and why? Who is their audience? Why does their work matter to that audience? How does their work fit into the culture, values, or goals of their discipline, of their institution? How has their work and the attention that it receives changed over time? And if their audience is outside academia, how has their work affected practice, policy, teaching, or other areas like this? So after we write that story in clear language, then we can go and carefully collect the most appropriate metrics that provide evidence for the types of impact we've described in our story. And we want to make sure we always have a justifiable reason for including each metric, rather than just stuffing in more numbers for the sake of numbers. One resource that can be particularly helpful here, I think I saw a question about the constellation, about a tool that might help us with the constellation of metrics. One tool I think that's helpful to at least think about that constellation is the Becker Library Framework for Assessing Research Impact. And again, there's a link to this in the slides, I promise. The Becker Framework suggests relevant indicators and supporting evidence for those indicators to show research impact in 5 areas: advancement of knowledge, clinical implementation, legislation and policy, economic benefit, and community benefit. So they provide suggestions of indicators in each of those 5 areas that will suggest a constellation of metrics that are going to be appropriate. So now I have a section here to look at some interactive exercises, and I think based on my time, I may only be able to get through about one of these, but I at least want to take a quick look at one of them. And this is just supposed to help you to help get you thinking about what kinds of metrics may be relevant to pull out and how we might contextualize them. So these exercises are not designed to have right and wrong answers. Different people are going to have different ideas about what's valuable and how to present it. So all of your perspectives may be valid. I just want us to have a chance to think through why we see value in certain metrics and how we might communicate it. So here's a set of screenshots that represents a particular article's record in dimensions. And I'm going to ask you to look over some of this information and share some comments in the chat about what stands out to you. So what types of metrics or measurements here seem meaningful? What sorts of contextual factors do you see that might be valuable? The information summarized here shows us where the article was published. It shows us the Altmetric badges here. The first 2 scholarly citations that mentioned this work, scholarly publications that cited this, and then also the policy documents that have cited this. I'm going to give you a few minutes to just mull over this and share any comments you have about what stands out to you. What's a number here that you might want to share with someone if this was your work? Okay, so Claire and David have both noticed it's got a lot of attention on Mendeley. Okay, and there's a comment that the nature of the paper suggests it would be valuable to practitioners as well as scholars. Okay, very good. Recency of the citation, I like that. Very exciting that there are policy citations, but Megan adds I would want to know more about the policy, right? see who's tweeting and look at their research focus. Okay, a couple more people noting the recent citations. All right, so I think you guys have noted some good things here. I'm going to share a few of the things that sort of stood out to me. Oh, I like that. Thank you, Liz, for pointing that out. Liz noted that the 2 policy citations are actually to the same policy. I'm so glad someone noticed that. I think that's a great example of some of the sort of duplication and error that we can sometimes see in automated citation gathering. So some of the things that stood out to me, the article was published in 2012, but its most recent citations date to 2017 and 2018. So that means it's still receiving a good amount of attention almost 7 years after its publication. It's had some good staying power. The policy document citation, as several of you noted, seems really significant. I would want to go pull up that document, see how it referenced this article. I would want to learn more about who is this analysis and policy observatory that published this policy document, and write some contextual narrative about the significance of this report and the significance of this article being cited in there. Now, my curiosity is also really sort of piqued by the second citing article here, this citing work called Predicting the Role of Library Bookshelves in 2025, because I'm noticing that it has a very high attention score from Altmetrics. So I might want to go and look at that one and look at the context of how it cites this work. Is it possible that this citing work getting a lot of attention might sort of indirectly bring attention back to this thing that it's referenced? That might not yield anything valuable, but it's something I'd want to look at. The 69 Mendeley saves, a number of you saw those. That's also very interesting. That could indicate some intent to cite the article in the future, or maybe looking at the title and nature of the article, maybe some interest in using this article to inform a library space redesign, something like that. But 7 years after publication, we also don't know how long ago those 69 Mendeley saves happened. So it may not show the potential for future citation the same way that it would for a newly published article. Okay, so I ran a little long, so I'm sorry. I'm going to skip past these other 2 exercises that I had, but I have a lot of notes in the slides if you're curious to look back at these and see what types of observations I thought were interesting. As promised, there are several slides here with links to all of the tools that I've mentioned, selected references for anywhere that I quoted a definition, or other resources that I just think are very, very valuable if you want to follow up on this some more. And then I've also included some relevant listservs here. Obviously not a comprehensive list of everywhere that people are discussing metrics, but these are some of my favorite areas. If you're really interested in learning more, these are some of my favorite places to follow intelligent conversation about metrics. And so now I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and get to a question period. So I would love to know what questions you have for me.
Great. Well, Erin, this is Taylor here, and we've had a few really good questions that have been entered through the chat box. So we'll start with those. One of the questions that we got while you were on the responsible use of metrics slide is there a tool that will give you a constellation of metrics without having to check multiple sites?
Sure. So that's a really great question, because I think the time-consuming nature of this is obvious. We can often find ourselves going to multiple sources to pull up different types of measurements. I mean, definitely starting with things like the Altmetric Explorer for librarians and dimensions, starting with some of those large tools, because they do try to pull in scholarly citations as well as the Altmetrics pieces. That gives you kind of one good starting point, at least, to have a lot of different measures aggregated in one spot. But I think ultimately it depends what your purpose is and how comprehensive you feel you need to be in that situation. If I'm actually pulling together a metrics report for a faculty member on my campus, I have a whole list of these tools that different tools and databases that I will go through very systematically, and 75% of them may yield nothing, but I will go through every resource and look up every title of the works that they've published and try to do a comprehensive systematic search. That may not be appropriate in every case. So I think it's really going to vary, but there's not any one perfect tool that aggregates everything. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, we also had a question more specifically about Clarivate Analytics and Web of Science. Could you talk more about that tool specifically?
Sure. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is. So Web of Science was previously owned by Thomson Reuters, who sort of developed the impact factor. Web of Science then was part of the package of resources that was sold to Clarivate Analytics. So Clarivate does now run Web of Science and also journal citation reports, which is the major tool where impact factor is officially published. I'm not sure if there's something else they wanted to know about Clarivate. If you want to ask a follow-up question. But.
That's great. So another question that we got was about graduate students. So this person is interested in how you talk about metrics in graduate student instruction, and is this something that they are requesting more at universities?
Oh, so that's a great question. We are really sort of in the early stages right now of better developing education and outreach on this kind of thing for graduate students. Most of the workshops and events I've offered in the past have been open to graduate students, but much more targeted at a faculty audience. And I think not really serving a graduate student perspective as well. I'm collaborating right now with our Office of Graduate Studies to kind of assess where our graduate students are in their existing knowledge of scholarly publishing and metrics and sort of all of these topics, figuring out where they're at and what they feel like they need and want to know. So for those graduate students who think they're going to go on into research, we want to be better preparing them for this stuff. I think one of the most useful things to share with graduate students up front is the idea that they are going to need to think about how they present themselves as a researcher. So even if they haven't started publishing in scholarly journals yet, going ahead and setting up some type of a researcher profile, whether that's using the ORCID ID or Impact Story or even just their LinkedIn profile, but finding some choice of a way to present themselves as a researcher and being prepared to co-locate citations to all of their work there, being prepared to be able to share metrics about their work in context, getting them thinking about the fact that there is kind of a self-promotion and marketing angle to being noticed and respected as a researcher. I hope that helps a little.
Absolutely. Can you recommend any additional good citation metrics tools for the humanities?
That is always so challenging. Definitely take a look at what Humetrics HSS is working on, even though it is still in work. One of the other tools that pops to mind immediately for humanities is the MLA Directory of Periodicals. Not that it provides a ton of metrics, but there's a lot of other sources out there for looking up journal information and trying to get a sense of a journal's influence that don't cover humanities journals as well. And the MLA directory has a better coverage of journals in the humanities and social sciences. So even though it has less information, it gives you a little bit more of a starting point to maybe find out how long has that journal been published, Is it published by a scholarly association that's important in that field? Sometimes you can find readership numbers. That's getting much less common. You could usually find acceptance rate, though, for humanities journals in the MLA directory. So you can get at least a little bit of a sense of how competitive is it to get an article in this journal based on their acceptance rate. So that's one tool I do sometimes look at for those, but it also just depends on whether you're working with articles or books, or when you get into the arts, it can get even harder if you're trying to find metrics for how many times something has been performed or exhibited, finding reviews of artistic exhibits, things like that. So it can vary a lot, but definitely arts and humanities is at a disadvantage for good choices of metrics.
So we had another question come in asking, is there a matrix which can be used at the time of hiring faculty, so lecturers, associate professors, full professors, deans, etc., mentioning minimum requirements?
That is a really interesting question. Unfortunately, I think that's going to vary too much by context. An R1, leading research university is probably going to have a very different vision of the minimum level of research and impact that they want to see versus a smaller, maybe more teaching-oriented institution. And different institutions place a different premium on the availability of metrics. There are, I think to some extent, this is why tools like Altmetric and Plum in the institutional subscriptions, this is one reason the institutional subscriptions are interesting, because they will let an institution look at the research across their body of faculty and see, overall our faculty get this kind of attention and have this kind of impact. And so then for their institution, they might be able to say, based on the people we already have on our faculty, we would expect new faculty members coming in to meet these certain standards, so that they're kind of up to par in our institution. But that's really going to vary very much by the individual institution.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. So we had someone ask, when is it valuable to invest a lot of time in looking up these metrics and crafting your research story? And what's the best way to share this information with others?
Yeah, that's a great question. When is it valuable? I mean, I think that's going to depend on your role and your goals. For me, as the scholarly communications librarian, when I have a faculty member come and say that they are preparing a grant application or they're preparing their tenure and promotion portfolio, and it's very important for them to have this type of information to make their case about why they've done well in their research. Because that's part of my job, I find it very valuable to put in that work to help them in those situations. Grant applications, I think, are one of those areas where it's beneficial not only to the researcher, but to their institution, that if we can craft a very good story that says the work this person is doing is demonstrably important, that story may help them to bring in that external funding for their work, which benefits the whole institution. So, I mean, it's kind of a case by case for you to decide whether it's valuable to invest that time. In terms of what's the best way to share the information, I think writing up that story, but thinking about what else could enhance it. So data visualizations, think about, is there a way I could put some of this into a bar chart or a pie chart or some type of a map? And that's going to depend on the body of work you're looking at. So if it's very important to show that this researcher has had a broad geographical impact, maybe a map showing where their attention has come from, that type of thing. Thinking about how you can help to visualize that data. And then really thinking about including some of those quality anecdotes not just numbers, but good examples from what you've found. You know, it got tweeted 20 times. Well, great. Is that meaningful? Or can you share one specific tweet that really gives more weight to it? All right, so I think we're out of time. Am I right?
Yeah, we have just one more interesting question that came in.
Okay.
If we have a minute to answer
Sure.
it before we wrap up here. So this is asking, are there impact metric problems with One Science being bought by Elsevier?
That is a fascinating question, and I am very, very honestly going to answer it as I don't know off the top of my head. I know over the past couple of years, there's a lot of tools related not only to metrics, but related to lots of different stages of the scholarly communications process. There's a lot of these tools that were more independently operated that have been bought up quite healthily by commercial parties like Elsevier and others. And there is a lot of debate as to what that means, what the significance of that is for the scholarly communications landscape when those corporate parties control all of this information. I'm not necessarily going to espouse any particular perspective on that, but there are a lot of really interesting articles and blogs and things out there on that topic. Yeah, I see Joel added like SSRN. Yes, that's a great example. When SSRN was bought by Elsevier, that's generated a lot of listserv discussion recently. So if folks are more interested in getting some of the pieces of that conversation, feel free to email me after the session, and I'm happy to try to share out some of those resources where people are kind of talking about those implications of scholarly or of a commercial purchase.
Well, great. Well, thanks so much to Aaron Owens, as well as my co-moderator from the ACRL ULS Professional Development Committee. I would also like to thank Elois Sharp and Sophie Skinner from ACRL. Remember that we will send a link to the recording for this session when it is available, which will be on Thursday. A reminder to please fill out the assessment instrument, a link to which has been posted in the chat window. The upcoming webinars from the ULS Professional Development Committee include I Didn't Mean Anything by It, How Racial Microaggressions Are Perceived, and this will be in April 2019. The committee will provide more information about this program over the next few weeks, and we hope that you will join us. So thank you for coming.